Study. We're continuing our series, our Lenten series, our Lenten journey, following the path of Christ from garden to glory, beginning with the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane to his resurrection and glory. And this morning we have three more moments 10, 11, and 12 on this journey. We have the women, the nails, and the shame. And this is where the actual crucifixion begins. So we're getting to it now. We're getting into the Easter season, and we're seeing the continuing path of the Christ. Now, I want you to think for a minute and try and think of a time that you have spent a lot of time planning something. You've put a lot of effort into something, a lot of investment into something. Maybe it was time, maybe it was money, energy, whatever it was, you put a whole lot into this one thing, planning it, and you're thinking, oh, this is going to be great, this is going to be one of the most amazing things that I've ever done, and then just as it's coming to it, everything falls apart. Does that ever happen to you? One of the stories that we've been hearing about this week is that for those of you with a 401k and hoping to retire someday, we've been hearing about the Dow Jones Industrial Average breaking its all-time high from October 2007. And maybe you're like a lot of folks who had a retirement fund that back in 2007 was looking pretty good, and then in 2008 wasn't looking so good. And sometimes we put all this energy and all this devotion into something, and then we just see things kind of tank. Well, there's a story about four boys. These four boys were high school seniors, and they were close friends. They played on the football team together. They played on the basketball team together. You never saw them apart. They were always together. These four boys, and so they always did everything together, and they came up with this great idea in their senior year of high school. Somebody that they knew was selling a boat. And it was just a motorboat, but none of their friends had a motorboat. There is a lake just outside the town that people loved going on the lake, but they always had to go on their parents' boats and with their parents. And they knew this guy who was selling his old motorboat. It was weather stripped and really beat down. The motor made really strange sounds when you turned it on, but they're like, this is our boat, we can buy this. And so they pooled their money together and they bought this boat, and they put all this energy into it, and they're like, we're going to make this look great. They stripped all the paint off of it and they painted it, and they're like, the one boy said, my dad's a mechanic, so, I've learned stuff in his shop. We can fix this engine. Not only can we fix it, but we can make it better. And so they set to work on fixing this engine. And they're working all throughout their senior year of high school on this, trying to get it ready for summer so that when summer came, they could take their boat out onto the lake and they could impress all their friends and impress the girls. And they could have fun out on the lake with their motorboat. So they start rebuilding this engine, and they get it working again. And they said, we can make this better. And they put more money into it, and they buy more parts for the engine. And so they keep adding onto the engine. They add a new exhaust system and an air intake and all these things. And they built up this engine that was this big when they started. By the time they were done, it was about this big. And they pull on the chain, and that thing roared to life, and it ran great. And they're like, this is amazing. We're gonna be the fastest boat on the water this summer. And so summer came, and they go take their boat and they put it on the trailer, and they take it out to the lake, and they back their trailer down to the water. This is their grand and glorious moment. And they're backing down to the water, and so that the trailer's just into the water, and they're about to let the boat go off the trailer to float out onto the water. This is their grand and glorious moment. And so they cut the boat loose, and they let it go into the water, and they put so much engine onto the back of that boat that it just kept going down to the bottom of the water. Their grand and glorious moment, their great planning, all their energy was gone just like that. And so they're sitting there and they're waiting. There's a man who came by and called the park service. It was a state park, so the park service was going to come and help them get their boat out and call a tower to come pull the boat up out of the water. And they're sitting there and they see gasoline and oil leaking up from the boat that's sitting underwater. And these boys are just sitting there and they've got their heads in their hands. And they're just like, this just can't possibly get any worse. And the man sitting with them turns to them and says, "You think this is bad? Wait till you get the bill from the park service for cleaning up this mess." But we're taking a look at this continuing journey. And if you remember last week, Jesus was along the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, and heading from his condemnation and heading to the moment where he was at the place where he was going to be crucified. And what we have in our first moment this morning is that Jesus is walking along the way, and he comes, and there are some women along the side of the road, and they're just wailing, they're crying. And basically, as I've been looking at this passage, there are basically two different theories about who these women were. The Bible doesn't specifically tell us who these women were, but there are basically two theories. And because I couldn't decide which one to go with, we're going to talk about both of them. But one of the theories is that these women who were standing there, who were crying for Jesus, were women who knew him. And we're going to take a look, if you want to turn to Luke chapter 8. We're going to take a look at Luke chapter 8 and take a look at one of the theories for who these women were. We're going to start at the beginning of chapter 8 and read through verse 3. Soon afterwards, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others, who provided for them out of their resources. Now, did you know that Jesus' financial support, as he's going around for 3 years teaching, through Galilee, through Judea, and through Samaria, that Jesus' financial support was coming from a group of women? That says something interesting about our tithing, maybe. It was the women who followed Jesus who were his financial supporters. And there's these group of women that followed Jesus who had prominent husbands, and they were very wealthy, and they gave out of their resources. And it was these resources that supported Jesus and allowed him to do what he did, because there's not a lot of money in the Galilee preaching circuit. So Jesus, as he went around, would be supported by people who went along with him. And there are these women who went along with him that helped support him. But then we come to this moment. These women who had given everything, who had given so much and expended so much time and energy, they walked with Jesus place to place. They listened to him. They listened to his teaching. They followed him. They obeyed what he said. They gave to his causes. And they said, this guy's got to be something. He's a great teacher. And now they're standing here by the side of the road, and they're seeing him walk by with a bloody back, the cross behind him, being led away to his death. Have you ever felt like you had given so much to one thing, that you invested so much in it, You know, it had to turn out a certain way or this was going to be a complete and utter failure. And so you keep going along that way, and then when everything turns out different than when you expected, it feels like a complete failure. It feels like everything has been a waste. And yet there's so many times when we put so much energy and we're faithful to something that when things turn out different than we expect, and because it turns out different than we expect, we see it as a failure, and we fail to see the successes in that. These women standing by the side of the road who had given so much of themselves, so much energy, so much time, so much money to support Jesus and to support what he was doing, had an expectation for what they expected success was going to look like. In the end, success came through death on a cross, which was not what they expected. But so often we fail to see the successes because the successes look different than we expect them to. Well, that's one theory of who these women were. There's another theory of who these women were as well. Now this way, the Via Dolorosa that I've been talking about, this road that leads from Pilate's mansion, the governor in Jerusalem, leading out to Golgotha, where crucifixions were done outside Jerusalem. This was a well-known road to the people in Jerusalem because anybody who was at Pilate's mansion who was condemned to die by crucifixion would then be led out on this road to Golgotha to be crucified. So this road was well known. And so there were professional mourners, I guess you would call them. Women who lived in Jerusalem, Jewish women who were against what the Romans were doing. And these women lived by this via, this road that led out of Jerusalem. And they would stand by the side of the road anytime that these criminals, Jewish men or women, being led out to be crucified. And they would come to the side of the road and they would mourn and they would wail and they would weep and they would cry openly over this thing that the Romans, the evil Romans, were doing. These things that the evil Romans were doing. So they stood by the side of the road and they would cry and they would show their grief not because they knew the particular individual who was being crucified, but because one of their people, one of the Jews, was being killed in a merciless way by these outsiders who have come in and have occupied our city. This is terrible. This is a terrible thing that the Romans are doing, so they would cry. And we're going to take a look in Luke chapter 23 at what Jesus says back to these women who are mourning by the side of the road because this Jewish man is being killed by the Romans. 23, and we're going to pick up at verse 27. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' They will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" So Jesus is being led by these women who are crying about this terrible thing that's happening to Jesus, and terrible thing that's happening to the Jewish nation, that their people can be killed by these Roman outsiders for seemingly no reason. They're crying over this, and Jesus turns to them and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, if you think this is bad, just wait. If you think this is bad, just wait till you see what's coming. Doesn't sound like much of a message of hope, is it? Sounds a little bit like the story of the optimist and the pessimist. The pessimist who says, things are terrible, things can't possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, well, that's no way to talk, of course they can. What Jesus is giving here to these women, he's not giving them a message of hope. Blessed are the barren. That is a completely backward statement in Jesus' time. Think about throughout the Bible, there are so many instances of women who did not have children, and it was a shame on them. There's Rachel, whose sister Leah was popping out children left and right, but Rachel couldn't have any for quite a while, and she bore that shame. There's Hannah, whose husband's other wife was having children, and Hannah couldn't have one, and the shame that she bore. And then Elizabeth, cousin of Mary, mother of Jesus, no children, the shame that she bore. The shame that comes along with not having children is one that was well known in this time. One of the worst things that could happen to a woman in this time was to not have any children. And then Jesus comes to them and says, daughters of Jerusalem, a time is coming when you will say, blessed are the childless. Blessed are the ones who have no children. That's how bad things are going to be. Because it's going to be even worse for those who do. And what Jesus is talking about this time is looking forward about 35, 40 years when the Romans were going to come in and they're going to throw down Jerusalem. They're going to tear down all the walls, not leave one stone standing upon another. The temple would be torn down and destroyed, and its people killed. Terrible time. You think it's bad what the Romans are doing now? It's going to get worse. And Jesus leaves it there. He doesn't give them a message of hope. He doesn't say, but if you look this way, you can have a different outlook on things. You know, if you turn your eyes a different way, then you can have a different outlook. Jesus doesn't say it to the women, but the message is there. The message is there that Jesus going to his death, saying that there's worse coming, it's showing that Jesus is showing that in his death is not the worst for him. That there is still good in this. And that after he rose again 3 days later, that there would be a hope, that there would be a hope of looking at things in a different way. It's like I said a minute ago, about when you have plans and expectations and things turn out different from expected. You don't see the successes unless you look at things a different way. Unless we change our way of looking at the world, unless we change our way of viewing things, we continue to see the failures. We continue to see, blessed are the barren. And we don't see the hope that comes behind it. Changing our point of view, changing our way of looking, changing our expectations, changes our way of viewing hope. It gives us the ability to see hope in the midst of the worst moments. Let me take you on. We've got 2 more moments to go. And I'm going to make you a deal. Because in the first moment for this morning, I split it into 2 and had 2 points. I'm going to take the last 2 moments and combine them into 1 point. Deal? All right. Our last two moments, we have the nails and we have the shame. And these two moments, it works well to put them together because these are two moments that are really happening simultaneously. And these are two moments that the way we look at them, really they could be switched. But they go together because this is the moment of crucifixion. This is the moment in which Jesus is nailed to the cross. And it's a vital moment for us to understand, especially as we look forward to next week and our moments that we're looking at next week and the week after, and the next 2 weeks of crucifixion and Jesus' death and burial. And it's important to understand crucifixion. Crucifixion is something that we don't understand, comprehend really all that much because we don't have crucifixions. There's something in our Constitution against cruel and unusual punishment, and this would definitely qualify because it is about the cruelest punishment that's ever been created. Now, the nails, when we think of nails, anybody here who's a handyman or like to do handy with tools or anything like that? Mr. Haywood, don't make me call you out a third time. Now, have any of you, while working with a hammer, maybe trying to hammer something in the wall or make something, have hit your thumb with a hammer? Yeah, I have. Did it hurt? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, have any of you accidentally hit a nail into your hand? Ouch. No, I haven't done that. I've come close because I'm just that talented. I have come close, but no, I have not hit a nail into my hand. But most of the time when we're working with nails, we're working with nails like that long, probably, or smaller, maybe that thick. And maybe that vision of a nail doesn't really give us a clear vision of what Jesus had to go through. Because when it's talking about the nails in the Bible, the nails of crucifixion, you got to think more like railroad spikes. We're talking about that thick around and probably about that long. And it says that Jesus was nailed through his hands. Likely it was through what we would call our wrists. It could have been through his hands, but it's more likely that it was between the two bones in the wrist, right there. And if you think that sounds painful, to have something driven through right there. Now here's one thing. I get to learn these things because my wife is studying to be a nurse. You know how many muscles you have in your hand? Actually, not very many. You know why? Because there's no room for them. You know where the muscles actually are? Yeah, right here. So when the nail went through, it was slashing right through the muscles, the blood vessels, the nerves that go right through. And so that's what was put through the wrists and into the wood of the cross. Now, the one interesting thing about crucifixion is that the Romans didn't always use nails. They did with Jesus, most often they did, but they didn't always use nails. Sometimes they would just take some rope and tie the person to the cross. Now, that doesn't sound nearly as effective to me. If you're trying to kill somebody, wouldn't you want to actually pierce through their body, cause some bleeding, weaken them somehow? Well, the thing about crucifixion, as terrible as the nails are, because the nails that go through the wrists and then through the feet, that's not the worst part of crucifixion. Not by a long shot. But it's not the nails that killed people who are being crucified. After the person has been crucified, they've nailed the person to the cross and tied the person to the cross, and the cross is laying on the ground. Now they've got to stand the cross up. Now, you handy people out there, have you ever had to build a fence or put in a fence post or anything like that? Did you take the fence post and just take it and jam it into the ground? It doesn't exactly work like that, does it? You got to dig a hole first, right? So you dig a hole for your post. You got to make sure it's a deep enough hole so that when it's standing up, the dirt around it can support it. Well, the Romans did the same thing with crucifixion. They would dig this deep hole so that the cross could go down into it deep enough so that it could hold a person up at the top of it. And so they would take this, after they dug the hole, they would take the cross and they would stand it up, and then they would push it off the edge of the hole down into the hole, and it would drop several feet into the hole. Now, you have to remember that the person on the cross is out like this, and the nails in their feet, that hurts. It hurts to push against them. And so they would hang by the arms stretched up, and the nails would hold them up by the bones of the wrist. And when the cross dropped down into the hole, because their weight was on their shoulders, it would pop their shoulders out of place, dislocating the shoulders. Doing that would cause their arms to go up further and their chest to come down lower so that they could no longer breathe. And so the only way that somebody who is being crucified could breathe would be to push up with their feet so that they could, because you couldn't pull up with your arms anymore because the shoulders are dislocated. They push up with their feet so that they could relieve the stress on their chest enough so that they could take a deep breath in and let it out and then fall back down again to where they couldn't breathe again. People who were crucified didn't die because of the blood loss through the wrists or anything like that. They died of suffocation because they would continue to do this over and over for each breath until they just did not have the strength to push with their feet anymore, and they would suffocate from lack of oxygen. This is why crucifixion is pretty much the most heinous way of execution that's ever been devised, because it could take days for this to happen. Somebody who was strong, who had a lot of strength and a lot of health before their crucifixion, could last a long time, pushing up with their feet, taking a breath, and falling back down. This is the crucifixion that Jesus endured. This is why the two thieves who were crucified next to Jesus, when they wanted to speed up their death, they broke their legs. Because if your legs are broken, then you can't push up with your legs, you can't breathe, you suffocate faster. Now, why did I tell you all this? I'll tell you in a minute, because we have the other half of this. We have the shame. At the same time that Jesus is being nailed to the cross, and the cross is being dropped in the ground, his shoulders are being dislocated, and he's beginning this cycle of suffocation and gasping for breath. At the same time this is going on, when they brought him to the place, they stripped him of his clothes, and they separated them among the soldiers. They cast lots for his garments. Somebody's got to take them. And it's an interesting thing that any time that you see a picture, you see a drawing or a depiction of Jesus being crucified, Jesus is always wearing a robe or some kind of loincloth or something like that around his midsection. That's not accurate. It's not an accurate portrayal of crucifixion. Because not only did they kill people with this hideous method of execution, but they stripped them completely naked. And not only did they do that, but the place where they crucified them was at a crossroads. They always did it along a road so that anybody traveling by the road could see them. This is the worst method of dying possible. It's complete shame. It's completely the lowest way of dying possible. The lowest one that anybody could be in their lives. So why is all this important? Why is all this important? One of the things about Jesus is that he went willingly to his execution. He went willingly to his crucifixion. We have to remember that the crucifixion in the grand scope of human history was only used for a couple centuries, really. And that Jesus could have come into the world at any time that God chose to send him. But God chose to send him at a point in time that crucifixion was being used. He could have sent Jesus in the time of 18th or 19th century France, when they had invented the guillotine. And Jesus could have been beheaded in one quick, instantaneous moment. But that's not the way that God chose to send him. That's not the time that God chose to send him. That's not the way that God chose for his son to be killed. Even at the time of Jesus' life and death, there were other ways of execution. There was stoning, there was beheading, there was hanging, there was drowning. There are many different ways that someone could be executed. But yet, God, the one who works through all of history, was working things together such that this was the way that Jesus would die. And one of the things that I found through studying the crucifixion, going through it time after time, is that crucifixion offers the best possible way for Jesus to show how much he loves us. Crucifixion shows the best possible way that Jesus shows how much he loves us.
Thank you, Jesus.
Jesus could have endured many different things, but he chose the worst to show us the best. It shows how much he loves us. It's impossible for us to underestimate and to understate how much that Jesus loves us. Even the crucifixion, even this horrible way of dying, does not show us completely how much God loves us. That Jesus was willing to go through the worst way of dying in order that he might be in relationship with us. Because that's what's at stake here. What's at stake here is us acknowledging that love and being able to love him in return. That's what's at stake here. And we're going to continue this journey over the next few weeks. We've got 3 more weeks until Easter. And this week is necessary to understand everything that transpires after. Understanding what happened when those nails passed through Jesus' hands. Understanding what happened to his body when that cross was dropped into the hole. We have to understand that. We have to understand that love. To understand everything else that transpires on the cross. So we're looking forward. And we're going to look forward to next week. Because we have more to learn.